I never thought my marriage would end with a simple accident, one moment of bad luck that shattered everything I believed in. But looking back, maybe it wasn't bad luck. Maybe it was fate, ripping away the blindfold I had worn for far too long. It happened on a cold November evening. I had come home earlier than usual, a rare break from my usual late nights at the office. I wanted to surprise my wife, Eloise. Maybe take her out to dinner, remind ourselves of the people we used to be before life became an endless cycle of work, sleep, and routine conversations. I walked through the door quietly, thinking I'd catch her relaxing on the couch, maybe watching one of those true crime documentaries she loved. Instead, I heard her voice, muted but clear, from the kitchen. "I can't stand him anymore." I stopped mid-step. My stomach turned cold. "He's just nothing. There's no passion, no excitement. I feel like I'm suffocating, living the same day over and over again." The words cut into me like a serrated knife, slow and jagged. My pulse pounded in my ears. I should have walked into the room. I should have made my presence known. Instead, I stood there, frozen, heart racing, ears straining to catch every painful word. If I could just leave without feeling guilty, I would. But he's so predictable, you know? I doubt he'd even fight for me. Something in me snapped. I turned and walked right back out the door. No dramatic confrontation. No anger. Just a hollow, numbing realization. I had been living in a marriage that was already dead. The worst part? She hadn't even noticed I was there. I drove without direction, my hands gripping the wheel like it was the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. My mind was a hurricane of emotions. Rage, sadness, disbelief. But beneath all of that, there was something else. A strange, unbearable quiet. Eloise's words kept replaying in my head like a cruel song on repeat. "I can't stand him anymore. I feel like I'm suffocating. He's so predictable." I didn't even realize where I was going until I pulled into the parking lot of an old gas station on the outskirts of town. The place looked abandoned, the fluorescent lights flickering weakly against the night sky. I parked, turned off the engine, and just sat there. For the first time in years, I felt truly alone. I checked my phone out of habit, but there were no messages. No missed calls. She still hadn't noticed I was gone. Maybe that was the answer I had been too afraid to see all along. This marriage, the life I had built with Eloise, it wasn't a partnership anymore. It was a habit, a routine, something she endured rather than cherished. And the worst part? I had been too blind to realize it. I thought about going back home, facing her, demanding answers. But what would be the point? Would she deny it? Would she backtrack and say it was just venting, that I had misunderstood? Even if she apologized, even if she cried, the truth would still remain. I had hurt her, and now I couldn't unhear it. I leaned back in the driver's seat, staring at the cracked ceiling of my car. I needed space, time, clarity. So instead of turning the key in the ignition and heading home, I did something I never thought I'd do. I disappeared. I drove to the next town over and checked into a small roadside motel. The kind with peeling wallpaper, humming vending machines, and a desk clerk who barely looked up as I slid my credit card across the counter. I told myself I'd only stay for the night, just to clear my head. But as I lay there on the stiff mattress, staring at the ceiling, something inside me shifted. Did I even want to go back? I woke up to the sound of the motel's ancient air conditioner rattling against the wall, pumping out air that smelled like dust and old carpet. It took me a second to remember where I was and why. Then it hit me. Eloise. The words. The quiet betrayal of a wife who had checked out of our marriage long before I realized it. I stared at the ceiling, my mind heavy with the weight of my own ignorance. Had I really been that blind? Had I spent years investing in something that was already dead? I pulled out my phone, expecting to see missed calls or messages. Maybe a "where are you?" Maybe even a frantic voicemail. But my screen was blank. She still hadn't noticed I was gone. That silence hit harder than anything she had said the night before. I rolled out of bed and splashed cold water on my face in the tiny motel bathroom. My reflection looked back at me, tired and unfamiliar. It was a strange feeling, looking at yourself and realizing you don't know who you are without the person you built your life around. I grabbed my keys and left. I didn't know where I was going, but I couldn't stay there. The thought of stepping back into our house, seeing her face, pretending that I hadn't heard what I had, it made my stomach turn. So I drove. For the first time in years, I let my instincts take me somewhere without a plan. I passed by places that had once meant something, our favorite diner, the bookstore where she used to drag me on Sundays, the park where we had once sat for hours, dreaming about the future. A future that had never really existed. Somewhere along the way, I found myself in front of an old cafe on the outskirts of town. It was one of those places that felt frozen in time, the kind of spot you'd find in a small-town movie. I had never been there before, but something about it felt safe. I stepped inside, the smell of fresh coffee and baked bread wrapping around me like a comfort I didn't know I needed. The place was nearly empty except for a waitress wiping down a table near the window. She looked up and smiled. A real smile. Not forced, not out of obligation, just a simple human connection. I hadn't realized how much I needed that. I sat down at the counter, and she came over with a menu. "You look like you could use something strong," she said, pouring me a cup of coffee before I even had the chance to ask. I nodded, running a hand through my hair. Yeah, I guess I could. And for the first time since I walked out of my house, I felt like maybe, just maybe, I wasn't completely lost. The first sip of coffee burned my tongue, but I welcomed the sharp sting. It grounded me, reminded me that I was still here, still breathing, still capable of feeling something, anything, after last night. The waitress, whose name tag read Della, watched me curiously. She must have noticed something in my face, the weight of exhaustion, the kind of hollowed-out expression people wear when they've been blindsided by life. "Rough night?" she asked, her voice casual but laced with genuine curiosity. I exhaled a short, humorless laugh. "Yeah, something like that." Della didn't pry. She just nodded and slid a plate of toast in front of me. "On the house. You look like you need it." I didn't argue. I hadn't eaten since yesterday, and my stomach twisted in protest as if only now realizing it had been neglected. I forced down a few bites, but my mind was too tangled to focus on something as simple as eating. My phone sat face down on the counter. I still hadn't turned it back on. I wasn't sure why I was avoiding it. Maybe because deep down, I already knew what I'd find. Nothing. No texts. No missed calls. No frantic messages from Eloise asking where I was, why I hadn't come home. It should have made me angry, but instead, it just solidified something inside me. I had spent the past 10 years thinking I was part of a team, thinking we were building something real. But I was just a placeholder in her life, a character she had outgrown but hadn't bothered to write out of the story yet. And the worst part? I had let her treat me that way. I had ignored the signs. The distant looks, the mechanical kisses, the way she had stopped reaching for my hand when we walked side by side. How long had she been feeling this way? A month? A year? Longer? I had been living in the ruins of something that had already collapsed. I took another sip of coffee, my grip tightening around the mug. Della came back, refilling my cup even though I hadn't asked. "You sticking around town for a bit?" I blinked at her, realizing I hadn't actually thought that far ahead. Was I going home? Was I going anywhere at all? "I don't know," I admitted. It was the most honest thing I'd said in a long time. She smirked, tapping the counter with her nails. "Well, if you need a place to clear your head, we don't get much traffic in the mornings. Good place to think." Think. That was all I had been doing since last night, and yet I still had no answers. I glanced out the window, watching as the early morning sun painted the sky in soft pinks and oranges. It felt like a different world, one I hadn't noticed before because I had been too wrapped up in a life that wasn't mine anymore. Maybe I wasn't ready to face Eloise yet. Maybe, for the first time in my life, I needed to put myself first. So instead of leaving, I nodded. "Yeah, maybe I'll stick around for a bit." Della just grinned. Smart choice. I didn't leave that morning, or the next. Instead, I stayed. Not because I had a plan, but because, for the first time in a long time, I had nowhere to be. No obligations. No expectations. Just the quiet hum of a small-town cafe, a bottomless cup of coffee, and a name that no longer felt like it belonged to anyone, mine. I avoided my phone for as long as I could. It stayed in my pocket like a lead weight, a reminder of the life I had walked out on. But eventually, curiosity won. I turned it on. A notification popped up immediately, a single missed call. My breath caught for a second before I realized it wasn't from Eloise. It was from my coworker, probably wondering why I hadn't shown up at the office. No texts. No messages. Nothing from my wife. I stared at the screen for what felt like an eternity, trying to decide how I felt about that. Was I relieved? Angry? Maybe both? I should have been furious. If the roles had been reversed, if she had disappeared overnight, I would have torn the world apart looking for her. I would have called hospitals, filed a missing persons report, done anything to make sure she was okay. But she didn't even check. That told me everything I needed to know. Della slid another cup of coffee in front of me, her expression unreadable. Still no word. I glanced up at her, surprised she had been paying attention. Nope. She leaned against the counter, arms crossed. You gonna call her? I shook my head. No point. Della raised an eyebrow, but didn't push. So what's next? That was the million-dollar question, wasn't it? I could go back. Pretend I hadn't heard what I did. Pretend we were still a married couple, not two people sharing a house out of habit. Or I could leave for good. The thought made my chest tighten. I wasn't sure if it was fear or freedom that I was feeling. But before I could say anything, my phone buzzed again. A message from Eloise. My stomach clenched as I opened it. Eloise. Hey, did you grab the dry cleaning? That was it. No, where are you? No, I'm worried. Just a casual question, as if nothing had happened. As if I hadn't walked out of our house in the middle of the night and disappeared. A slow, bitter laugh escaped me. I had my answer. I put my phone down, picked up my coffee, and took a long sip. Della watched me carefully. So, I exhaled, a strange calm settling over me. I think I just made my decision. I didn't reply to Eloise. Not because I wanted to be petty, but because I realized something in that moment. She wasn't asking where I was because she didn't care. She wasn't wondering why I hadn't come home because she had already written me out of her life. I had been a ghost in my own marriage long before I left that night. I stared at her text a little longer, waiting for some kind of reaction inside me. Anger, sadness, regret. But there was nothing. Just a quiet understanding that I didn't belong there anymore. Della must have noticed the shift in my expression because she didn't ask any more questions. She just poured me another cup of coffee and gave me space to breathe. I needed air. So I left the cafe, stepping into the crisp morning, the town still waking up around me. The streets were empty, the sky a pale shade of blue, and for the first time in years, I felt untethered. I started walking, block after block, past old brick storefronts, faded murals, and sleepy sidewalks. I wasn't heading anywhere in particular, just letting my feet take me where they wanted. And as I walked, I thought about all the years I had given to Eloise. The vacations she had planned without asking me. The quiet sighs when I tried to start conversations. The way she had stopped touching me, stopped looking at me the way she used to. Had I really been this blind? Or had I just not wanted to see it? I passed by a small park and sat down on a weathered wooden bench, the sun filtering through the half-bare trees. An old couple walked by, hand in hand, their steps slow but in sync. I watched them with an unfamiliar ache in my chest. I had wanted that once. A love that lasted. A life that meant something. But maybe I had been holding on to something that was never really mine. My phone buzzed in my pocket again. I pulled it out, expecting another careless message from Eloise. But this time, it wasn't her. It was my coworker, a guy named Vaughn. Vaughn, hey man. You okay? Boss said you didn't show up today. Let me know if you need anything. I stared at the message for a long time. It was such a simple thing, but it hit me harder than I expected. Someone had noticed I was gone. Someone had cared enough to ask. I should have replied, should have reassured him. But instead, I turned off my phone again and let my head fall back against the bench. I wasn't going back. Not yet. Maybe not ever. For the first time in my life, I had nothing tying me down. And I had no idea what I was supposed to do with that. I don't know how long I sat on that park bench, staring at nothing, letting the cold air numb my face while my thoughts swirled like autumn leaves caught in the wind. The weight of my decision pressed against me, but instead of panic, I felt something else. Something foreign. Relief. I had spent years molding myself into the man I thought Eloise needed. The dependable husband. The predictable one. The man who never argued when she changed plans, never pushed back when she withdrew. I thought that was what love was. Compromise, patience, understanding. But in reality, I had just been making myself smaller. I had erased parts of myself to fit into her version of our life. And now? Now I was just a man sitting on a park bench with no home to return to. A gust of wind shook the branches above me, scattering golden leaves across the pavement. The sight should have been peaceful, but it only reminded me of all the small moments I had missed in my own life. How many sunsets had I ignored, too busy working late for a wife who barely noticed I existed? How many times had I swallowed my feelings, pretending everything was fine just to keep the peace? Had I ever really been happy? I closed my eyes and let the thought sink in. I had spent so long chasing the idea of a good marriage that I had ignored the reality of a failing one. Maybe this was my chance. Maybe this wasn't the end of something, but the beginning. My phone buzzed in my pocket again, and this time, I forced myself to look. Eloise, are you coming home soon? That was it. No, I'm worried. No, where are you? Just another casual, detached message. She didn't care why I was gone. She just wanted to know if I was coming back so she could decide whether or not to make dinner. Something inside me snapped. I stood up so fast the bench creaked beneath me. I needed to move. To get away. I shoved my phone back into my pocket and started walking again, my feet carrying me towards something, anything other than the life I had left behind. For once, I wasn't going to be predictable. I walked for what felt like hours, past streets I didn't recognize, past houses where strangers lived lives I'd never know. With every step, something inside me unraveled, old habits, old fears, old versions of myself I no longer wanted to carry. And yet, the weight of Eloise's last message still sat heavy in my pocket. Are you coming home soon? It was such a simple question, but it told me everything I needed to know. She wasn't asking out of love. She wasn't worried. She just wanted to know if I'd show up like I always did, predictable, obedient, easy to ignore. I pulled out my phone, staring at her words, feeling a final wave of exhaustion settle over me. Then, without hesitation, I typed my reply. Me. No, I'm not. I hit send before I could second-guess myself. And then, I blocked her number. The moment I did, something strange happened. The air felt lighter. My chest loosened, like I had been holding my breath for years and had finally let it go. I didn't belong to Eloise anymore. I belonged to myself. I found myself back at the small cafe where this new version of my life had started. Della was still there, wiping down the counter, but when she saw me, she raised an eyebrow. Well, thought you might have skipped town, she teased, sliding a coffee in front of me without asking. I exhaled a laugh, shaking my head. Not yet. She studied me for a second, something knowing in her gaze. You look different. I took a sip of coffee, letting the warmth settle in my chest. Yeah, I said quietly. I think I am. For the first time in years, I wasn't lost. I was free.